everybody, this is Mark Maritato. Thank you for joining me once again for another video. Today we are painting a Confederate soldier of the 3rd Mississippi Infantry, specifically Company B, which were known as the Sunflower Dispersers. Now, the reason why they were known as the Sunflower Dispersers is for a very interesting reason, which I will explain to you in a moment. But before we begin, folks, if you would not mind, please hitting the like button on the video. And if you like our content, please subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell so that you get notifications of when the next video will be released, and feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. All of this helps us to bring you more content. Also, don't forget to check me out on my social media pages. I have a Facebook and an Instagram page. Thank you. I'm going to leave a link in the description of this video to a brief history of the 3rd Mississippi Infantry Regiment so that you can check that out for yourself. But the reason why I was interested in painting this particular unit was because of the shirt that this company of this particular regiment was issued. The design of the shirt was pretty interesting. Now you may wonder why this soldier is wearing a gray shirt with red trimming, and the reason why is because early in the Civil War, Confederate regiments were organized in each individual states by the different towns and regions that were within that state. And each company would form, it would usually be about 100 men per company, and one regiment, let's say, would have 10 companies. So Company A would be from one region, Company B would be from a different region or a different town of that same state, and so on and so on and so on. Now, in the Southern armies, each company of a particular regiment would be allowed to uniform themselves the way they wished to uniform themselves. So basically, if one company of a regiment wanted to wear completely bright yellow shirts, let's say, with red trousers or something like that, they were allowed to do so. Or if another company wanted to wear, say, like a Revolutionary War style Continental Army uniform, they would be allowed to do so. And each company would also name themselves a different name. So one company of a particular regiment would name themselves, say, the Chattahoochee Lincoln Killers, and another one would be, say, the Calhoun Guards or the Liberty Guards, or some kind of name that would distinguish themselves as a particular company of the regiment that they are forming up with. When the regiment came together, it would be a hodgepodge of uniforms from 10 different regions or towns of the state that that regiment came from. So this particular regiment, the 3rd Mississippi Infantry, or this particular company of the 3rd Mississippi Infantry, I should say, decided to wear a gray flannel shirt with red trim. The reason why they called themselves the Sunflower Dispersers was because this particular company hailed from Sunflower County, Mississippi. What they decided to do was put a sunflower plastron on the chest of the shirt as a decorative symbol to show that they were from this particular county from Mississippi. Now, normally during the Civil War, a uniform, depending on which army you were in, either the Northern or the Southern Army, would have a different color to represent the branch of service that you were serving in. So say if you were an infantry soldier, usually on both sides of the conflict, that would be denoted in a blue color for the infantry. If you were serving in the cavalry, the color for the branch of that service would normally be yellow. And then if you were serving in the artillery, that particular color would be red. Now, this wasn't set in stone for all the different states during the war. In Mississippi, for instance, the branch color for infantry was red. So many of the soldiers from Mississippi serving in the infantry units would have their uniforms trimmed in red, and this would be earlier in the war before they standardized the uniforms on both the Union and Confederate side. In the beginning of the war, the Confederate Army wore basically a hodgepodge of different colors, as I mentioned before. And in a lot of cases, in some of the earlier battles, some Confederate soldiers were wearing blue uniforms, while some northern units would be wearing gray uniforms. And this would be a holdover from the militia regiments that served the states before they were mobilized to fight in the Civil War. Later on, these uniforms would become standardized in blue and gray, for blue being in the Union Army and gray being for the Confederate Army. But there were a lot of instances during the beginning part of the war, during battles, where friendly units dressed in different uniform colors on the same side would fire on each other by accident, or there would be friendly fire incidents where tragically people would be killed because they were wearing a uniform that their friends thought were part of the enemy's army. So for this figure study, I'm using my usual combination of watercolor and gouache. Gouache is a opaque watercolor, while watercolor is just a translucent watercolor paint. Basically, it's a water-soluble paint with pigment that is more translucent. The gouache is more of a paint that is less see-through than watercolor and allows you to get some really nice detail. If you really get into it, it yields some stunning results if you work with it. And the reason why I like working in gouache and watercolor is because it allows me to get the overall feeling of the figure down pretty quickly. It dries pretty fast, and it also allows me to work loosely and then tighten up in areas where I really want to get some more tighter details in, which is a really nice thing to be able to do on a figure study such as this. Also, one of the nice advantages to using gouache is that it allows you to fix mistakes or change things pretty quickly. So once the gouache dries, you can pretty much go over it with another layer of gouache to change a particular area if you need to. Now, you do have to be careful when you use gouache, because in some areas, if you lay the paint on too thickly on the first pass, then you need to go over it again. When you go over it on the second pass, you will lift that first layer up with the water that is in your paintbrush. So a lot of times, if you want to change an area or fix an area, what I recommend doing is to blot that area with a wet piece of paper towel or some kind of damp cloth to take up the paint that's on the first layer. You just want to dab it, kind of take off the first layer from the paper, and then once you've allowed it to dry, go over it again with another layer of the gouache to fix that particular area. I also find that with gouache, in some cases, if you make a mistake, you can just take a damp piece of paper towel and literally just wipe it right off of the paper, and usually it'll get most of the paint off. Sometimes you might have to go over it again with another layer of paint or cover it up with white if it's in a white area. But for the most part, gouache is very forgiving and very versatile for creating a figure study like this, or basically just anything that you want to paint. It's a great medium to work in. So there's a couple of different ways that I approach laying down the paint when I paint with these two mediums. With dark colored objects, say like shoes, like I'm working on now, I will usually start by putting down a layer of the translucent watercolor first with my darker tones. So any colors or tones that will show in the painting as darker tones I will usually paint those in the watercolor paint because I want the shadows to be a little bit more translucent. And then what I will do is paint over those areas in gouache to bring out the medium tone areas and the lighter color areas, and then I will use gouache for highlights. It's not always the case that I do that, but for the most part that's kind of how I roll with this. There's going to be some situations where I'll be putting down, say like in the trousers as you're seeing here, I will put a layer of gouache down first and then go over it with shadows in watercolor as my darker tones, because again, that watercolor is more translucent and I like my shadows to be a little bit more on the translucent side as I work, and I think that it gives an overall nicer effect in the original artwork. When you look at the original artwork, you'll see that the darker shadowy areas are a little bit more on the translucent side, and then the lighter tones painted in gouache are much more opaque, and it gives a much nicer effect to the finished painting. So this long knife-like weapon that is hanging off of this man's belt is known as a sword bayonet. And basically what it was a long knife-like bayonet that was issued to a very particular type of rifle called a Mississippi rifle. So the Mississippi rifle was a short two-banded musket that some soldiers in the South would be issued, not all of them. Many soldiers in the Civil War would be issued three-band muskets, which were much longer and had a different type of bayonet that was more like a long pointed knife, shorter than the sword bayonet shown here. But this particular unit did seem to have, or this particular company seemed to have had Mississippi rifles in which these long bayonets would have been issued along with them. Alright folks, so I'm going to let the video play out. If you have any questions about anything regarding the artwork or the video, or if you have any suggestions for anything that you would like to see in our future videos or future subject matter, please leave it in the comments section. We'll be more than happy to answer those questions and concerns for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and we hope that you enjoy. Alright folks, we've reached the end of another video. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. We really hope you enjoyed it. Here is the finished artwork. If you should have any questions or interest in the original artwork or purchasing prints, please contact us at our website at maritato.com. Thank you very much.